If you're new to programming or new to JavaScript, but you think Screeps is really cool and you really want to play it, in this video, I'm going to show you the simplest Screeps code possible. And I'm going to walk you step by step through each line of code and tell you what it does, how it works, and how I got there. Super beginner friendly is my goal here. Hey, I'm Ben. This is Learn Code by Gaming. And to get started with this tutorial, we just need to go to the Screeps simulation room. So go to screeps.com, scroll down to the live demo. And for the simulation mode, choose training. This will bring you into the training room for Screeps. You don't even need to register or anything to follow along. So the first thing it's asking you to do is place your spawn. This is a building that's going to create creeps for you. And you want to place it somewhere near this energy source and near the room controller. And you can just keep the default name of spawn1. Then in the lower left, click Script to open up your code. And go ahead and expand it upwards so you can see more of it. So the first bit of code they give you when you're starting out is this module.exports.loop equals some function. So what this is it's the main loop that gets exported and run by the Screeps server. And any code you put inside these curly brackets is going to be run once per tick. So anything you want to do with your creeps or your structures needs to go inside these curly brackets. Or at least it needs to be initiated from there. And you don't need to fully understand how all this is working to get started. Just think of it as boilerplate code that needs to be there in your main script. And remember that all the code you want to write needs to go inside these curly brackets. And the first line of code they give you in the main game loop is actually just a comment. You create comments in JavaScript by using 2 backslashes. And you can write whatever you want inside of a comment. Comments are ignored when your code is executed. So this is your space to take notes and to give yourself reminders about what you're doing. And every programming teacher ever is going to tell you to leave a lot of comments because it's really good advice. So let's change this comment here to remind us about how the main game loop works. This is the main game loop. The code inside of these curly brackets will run once per tick. And while we're talking about ticks, over here in the upper right, you can control the tick speed inside the simulation. So you can pause the game, or you can change the tick speed to speed up or slow down the execution of your code. Now, before we start writing any code, let's first just talk conceptually about what we want to do to write the simplest Screeps code possible. So right now, all we have is a spawn, and a spawn can be used to create creeps. And the object of the game is we want to harvest energy from an energy source, and we want to bring that energy over to the room controller to upgrade it. And as our room controller is upgraded, that will allow us to build stronger creeps and to build more structures. So to do that, we need to, from our spawn, create a creep. We then need to program our creep to go over to the energy source and harvest it, and then carry that energy from the energy source over to the room controller and upgrade it. And we want our creep to just go back and forth, doing that process forever. So now that we've talked about what we want our code to do, the next thing I like to do, especially when something is new or complex for me, I like to just outline my logic in comments. So this isn't any code I'm writing yet, it's just notes to myself about what I want to do. This breaks everything down into smaller chunks that I can then tackle one at a time. So the first thing we want to do is we want our spawn to create a creep if it doesn't exist yet. So if our creep doesn't exist, create it from our spawn. Okay, so once our creep exists, we want to create an easy reference to our creep because we're going to be using it a lot to tell our creep what to do, and we don't want to look up that reference every time. So next we want to get a reference to our creep. So we've created a creep, we've got an easy reference to it. The next thing we want to do is have our creep perform its logic. And the logic for this creep is if it doesn't have any energy, we want it to go to the energy source and harvest some. So if creep has no energy, go to the energy source and harvest some. But if our creep does have energy, we want to take it to the controller and upgrade it. but if our creep does have energy, bring it to the controller and upgrade it. All right, so we've outlined our logic, and we know if we can just accomplish these 4 things, we'll have a fully functioning Screeps code. So now all we have to do is fill in the blanks. So let's start with the first one. If our creep doesn't exist, create it from our spawn. Okay, so how are we going to do that? Well, we know that we have our spawn here, and we know that it must have some way to create a creep. So let's go over to the documentation and figure out how to do that. So from the left panel here, I can pull down the documentation. And I'm going to go right to the API reference. Then I'm going to scroll down to the structures, and specifically the spawn structure. So here it tells us that the spawn is your colony center. This structure can create, renew, and recycle creeps. All of your spawns are accessible through the game.spawns hash list. So inside structure spawn, it's probably going to have some sort of method that allows us to create a creep. So as we scroll down here, all of these green items are properties, and those are just pieces of data that each one of our spawns possess. And the blue items are methods, and methods are what allow us to perform some sort of action. So if we keep scrolling down, you'll eventually get here to spawn creep. This is the method that we're looking for. So I'm just going to copy this spawn creep function definition, go back to our code, and I'm just going to paste it here below our comment that says that we want to create a creep. And this square brackets ops here, those are optional parameters and we don't need them, so I'm just going to go ahead and delete it. So now our spawn creep function wants 2 parameters. It wants a body definition and it wants a name for our creep. So looking back at the documentation, you can see that the body parameter, it needs to be an array of strings. And this array describes the new creep's body. So basically every creep is made up of different parts, and you get to decide what your creeps look like as far as what body parts it has. And the more parts it has, the more expensive it is to create. So if we go back and look at our spawn, over on the right here, you can see that the spawn that we have selected is 300 out of 300 energy right now. So it has a maximum of 300 energy, so we can't build any creeps that cost more than 300 energy. And we'll come back to this in a minute. So back in our code, let's define an array that describes our body. And arrays in JavaScript are created with square brackets. And anything inside of these square brackets is going to be something that's in our array. And an array is just a list of data. In this case, we want our array to be different body parts that will make up our creep. And the available body parts are listed here in the documentation. And we only need to worry about the first 3, the work, the move, and the carry. So we do know that we need at least 1 work part, both to harvest from a source and to upgrade a controller. You need a work part. And work does need to be in all caps because this is a constant that Screeps defines. And if you don't put it in all caps, exactly how Screeps defines it, it won't recognize what you mean. And we always separate different items in an array with commas. So following our work part, we also need a move part, and this will allow our creep to move. And the one final thing we need is we need a carry part. And this is what will allow our creep to carry energy, which is something it needs to do because we need to carry the energy from the energy source to the controller. So we've got a work, a move, and a carry part on our creep, and hopefully that's less than 300 energy. And we can confirm that in the documentation. We're going to look at the constants. And in this part of the documentation, it lists all the different constants defined inside the game. So we want to find the move, work, and carry right here. And you can see that these constants actually just correspond to strings. And back in the spawn creep documentation for the body parameter, it lets us know it wants an array of strings. So what we have here, using these three work, move, and carry constants, they'll actually be replaced with those strings. So you could use strings here. For example, call this one work, but it's better to use the constants in case those values ever change in the future. And back in the documentation for those constants, you can see right below those, there's another constant for body part cost. And this lists out the energy cost for all the different body parts. So we're using one work part, which costs 100 energy. We also have a move part, which costs 50, and a carry, which also costs 50. So 200 energy is how much it will cost to spawn our creep. But if you read the documentation further, you'll find out that the way that these move parts work is in order for your creep to move every single tick, you need to have the same number of move parts as you have all the rest of your parts. So in this case, we have a work and a carry part. So we'll need 2 move parts in order to be able to move every tick. So now we have 2 move parts to outweigh our other 2 parts. We'll be able to move every tick, and we know that the move parts are 50 energy. So in total, we now have 250 energy we're using to create this creep, which is less than the 300 energy maximum that we have. So we're good there. For the next parameter, the name, let's go back and look at the spawn creep documentation again. And the name needs to be a string, and this is the name of a new creep. It must be a unique creep name. So this is because we can reference our creeps by their names. So there can't be any overlap in your creep names, or that lookup would be ambiguous. So let's give our creep a name. Strings in JavaScript are surrounded by quotes. And you can see that the syntax highlighter also turns it green for us to let us know that it's a string. And you can name your creep whatever you want. I'm going to call mine my first creep. And then every statement in JavaScript ends with a semicolon. And this lets the JavaScript interpreter know that this is the end of the line. This is useful in case a line of code gets really long. You can actually break it into multiple lines and it won't cause any errors because the interpreter knows just to look for the semicolon at the end. Now, in order to save our code and have it start reflecting inside the game, we use this check mark over here to commit our code. And if there's any problems with our code, it'll show up over here on the console, and it gives us this red warning indicator to let us know that something's wrong. So if I click on the console, we see these errors popping up every tick that say spawn creep is not defined. So I'm going to go ahead and pause our game, just so we don't get a long list of this error. And the spawn creep is not defined. That's the key part of this error message. It's letting us know that this spawn creep that we're using doesn't recognize what this means. And this makes sense if you think about it, because we haven't actually told it what spawn building we want to create the creep from. This spawn creep function is actually attached to objects, and specifically it's only attached to the structure spawn objects. So the second part of this task here is to figure out how do we get a reference to this spawn that we want to create our creep from. So let's go back to the documentation. I want you to look over here at the global objects. The global objects contain all the data about the state of the game as a whole. And the nice thing about the global objects is they're available anywhere inside of your Screeps code. You'll always have access to them. And the big one that has most of the information about what's going on inside the game is just the game object. So if you open that documentation and you scroll down, you'll see that the game object has all kinds of different properties. And the one we're interested in right now is the spawns. So the spawns is a hash containing all your spawns with spawn names as hash keys. So the way hashes work is they're kind of like arrays in that they're a list of data, but instead of being an ordered list of data, each piece of data inside a hash is actually just assigned to a key. And you use that key to access the data that you're looking for. So actually, if you just scroll down here to the get heap statistics, there's a good example of a hash. You can see that this hash is defined inside of curly brackets. And if this were an array, these would be square brackets instead. And inside these strings, like the total heap size, those are the keys inside the hash. And the data that's being held at that key is the number here to the right of the colon. So what all this means is inside the game spawns property, the spawn that we're looking for is going to be keyed to the name that we gave our spawn. So back inside our code, we can write game with a capital G, and that refers to the global object that's available to us. And we know that the game object has a spawns property. You access properties and methods on an object using a dot or a period. And as you saw there, it'll actually do an autocomplete for us to let us know that spawns is a property on the game object. And we just want to get a reference to the spawn right here. And the way that you access a value inside of a hash in JavaScript is again with square brackets. And inside these square brackets, you need to give it a string, which is the key for the item inside the hash that you want. So in this case, the string should just be the name of our spawn, and our spawn name is spawn1. You can see that here over top the spawn. You can also see it by looking at the property of the spawn on the right. You can see the name is spawn1. So I'll type in spawn1. So this spawn1 string is the key that we're using to access our hash. And after referencing that spawn, we need another dot. That's because this game.spawns, spawn1, that's going to evaluate to a structure spawn object. And spawn creep is a method belonging to that object. So these dots are used to separate properties or methods from the object they belong to. So to break this down one more time, game is a global object, and spawns is a property that exists on that object, and we use the dot then spawns to get to that property. And spawns itself is a hash that uses the spawn names as the key. So we access the information in that hash by giving it the key with our spawn name. So the first portion of this code is going to evaluate to a structure spawn object that references our spawn right here. Then from that structure spawn object, we want to call the spawn creep method on it. And as we discussed earlier, spawn creep takes these two arguments, the body and the name of the creep. And you can go back and verify all this in the documentation if that's an exercise you'd find helpful. So we finally arrived at the working code for creating a creep. And I know it seems complicated at this point, but this really is the best way to keep code organized and sensible. It can seem overwhelming at first, but if you can get your head wrapped around how each piece of the data you need and each method that you need to call is something belonging to an object, and those objects are often encased in other objects, then you'll be well on your way to not only understanding Screeps, but to understanding programming in general, because this is what we mean by object-oriented programming. And if you were clever when we were looking at the documentation, you might have noticed over here on the right of spawn creep, it actually gives you an example of how to use it. And this first example is actually very similar to the solution that we ended up using to spawn a creep. So now, if we commit this code and run the simulation again, you'll see that there's a line that's going around the spawn, and this indicates that it's creating a creep. And the more parts that you have on your creep, the longer it's going to take to spawn it. You also notice that the yellow circle inside of the spawn has shrunk. That's because we used that 250 energy to create this creep. And on the right, you can actually see that the energy in the spawn has dipped down, and it's now gaining back 1 energy every tick. And now that our spawn has finished creating our creep, it's popped out right here. And it's just sitting there waiting for us to tell it what to do. One thing to note before we move on is, remember I told you that this game loop is running once every tick? This means that every tick of the game, it's calling this spawn creep again, which could be problematic because you'll notice from our comment that we only want to create a creep if it doesn't already exist. But because each of your creeps must have a unique name, and we're giving it this same name every time, what's happening is this spawn creep function is recognizing that this creep already exists for this name, so it's not creating another one. So spawn creep is actually returning a non-fatal error, and that's not being reported to the console. But if we did look at the spawn creep method yet again, scroll down a little bit, and notice it has a return value. So when we do create the creep successfully, it's going to return this OK constant. But every time we call spawn creep method and our creep already exists, it's going to be returning this error name exists value. And these return values are here so that we actually have some way of knowing if the spawn creep function failed or not. And if we want to look at what the return value was, we could create a variable to store it. And you would do this like var for variable. We can name it result. This is just the name of the variable. We can give it whatever name we want. And then we're going to assign it to whatever this spawn creep method returns. And so then result would hold one of these values every tick. In our case right now, it would be holding the error name exists value. And the raw value for that constant is -3. But that's getting a little bit off track for now, and it's perfectly fine to ignore the return value. We don't need to do anything with it, and our code will still work, which is fine. So the next thing we want to do is we want to get an easy reference for our creep. And this part isn't absolutely necessary. We could just keep referencing our creep from the game object. But because we're going to be using it a lot, it's helpful to create a variable that will just hold a reference to our object. So let's create a variable. Again, it's var to do that. And then this part is your variable name, and you can call it whatever you want. I'm going to call mine myCreep. And when you create a variable, you usually want to put some sort of data inside of that variable right away. So when you declare a variable like this, you're basically asking for a little bit of room in memory to store something. And what we want to store in here is our creep object, specifically the myFirstCreep object. So to get that reference, we're going to again look at the game object. And let's go back to the documentation for the game object. And inside the game object, you will see that there is a creeps hash. So it says this is a hash containing all of your creeps with creep names as hash keys. So it'll be game.creeps. And we know how to access objects inside of a hash. You use the square brackets. And inside those square brackets, you give it a string with the key that you want. And in this case, our key is going to be myFirstCreep, because that is the name of the creep object that we want. And then don't forget the semicolon at the end of the statement. So we'll commit that and check to see if there are any errors coming out of the console. I'm going to clear these old errors. And everything looks fine in our code right now, it seems like. If we want to confirm that we have the correct reference to the creep that we believe we do, then on myCreep, which is a creep object, let's look up what creeps can do. Back in the documentation for creep. And of course, they have a lot of different properties and methods on creeps. And we can get a quicker view of all those looking here on the left. And one thing a creep can do is it can say. And if you call the say method on your creep and you give it some text to display, it will visually display that, whatever you want your creep to say. So let's do that. So myCreep.say, because this is a method on all creep objects, and we can just give it some message. I'll have mine say, I live. Remember the semicolon, and let's commit that. So now our creep is saying, I live every single tick. So now we know we do indeed have a proper reference to that creep. So this is just a little bit of debug code that we don't need anymore. If you wanted, you could comment it out just by adding those 2 slashes to the front of it. But I'm just going to go ahead and delete it. And if we commit this, our creep will stop talking. So now let's go back and reread the next step here. If a creep has no energy, go to the energy source and harvest it. So the first part here, the if creep has no energy, that's a very obvious use case for an if statement. And an if statement in JavaScript allows you to execute a bit of code only under certain conditions. So we're going to say if in all lowercase, and that is a keyword in JavaScript. And then we're going to use parentheses. And inside these parentheses, this is where we write the condition that we want to evaluate. So in this case, we want to check to see if the creep has no energy. And we can assume in this case it's going to be my creep that contains the data that we need. We want to see how much energy my creep has. So let's go back to the creep documentation. And looking through all of these properties and these methods, it might not be immediately obvious what we're looking for, but it's actually this store property. So store is a property on every creep, and it contains a hash of every possible resource in the game that your creep could be carrying. So myCreep.store is the property we want. myCreep.store. And this is a hash. So accessing a hash, we use the square brackets. And the thing we want here is we want to check how much energy the creep is carrying. And this key is going to be available in the constants. There's a constant for resource energy. And that's the one that we're looking for. And you would know that either from doing the in-game tutorial or from reading the gameplay articles in the documentation. So I'll copy that, set that as our key. So myCreep.store resource energy, this entire bit of code right here, that's going to evaluate to a number that represents how much energy this creep is carrying. So right now, if we look at our creep, inspect it, our creep is carrying 0 energy. And we can see in the carry over here, it's 0 out of 50, and it says empty. So this whole bit of code is going to evaluate to 0 right now. But as our creep starts to harvest energy, this value is going to go up. So for our if condition, we want to check to see if this value is 0. So if the creep stored energy is 0, we want to do something. Specifically here, we want to go to the energy source and harvest energy. So first we have to check to see if it is equal to 0. And in JavaScript and in a lot of programming languages, you use the double equal sign to check for equality. So we'll see if it's equal to 0. So now we have a true or false statement that's appropriate for an if condition. And now that we have that, we want to do something just in this one case where the creep is carrying 0 energy. And the syntax for if statements is the parentheses part, which is the condition we're checking, and that's followed by curly brackets. And everything inside of these two curly brackets is going to be the code that's run only in the case where this if condition is true. So inside these curly brackets is where we want to go to the energy source and to harvest the energy. And I'll move a little faster here. So myCreep, it has another method on it called moveTo. And in here, you just give it the place that you want to go to. So we're going to call that source, which doesn't exist yet, but we'll come back to that in a moment. And then we also want to harvest. So myCreep.harvest. And what do we want to harvest? We want to harvest from the source. So every tick where the energy carried by the creep is equal to 0, the creep is going to be told to move towards the source and also harvest the source. Now you can only harvest a source when you're in range. So the ticks where the harvest fails, it's actually going to return some sort of fail message. But just like before with the spawnCreep method, we can choose to just ignore the result that's returned. And that's not a problem. We won't get any error messages to our console or anything. So stepping back now, before we can have our creep move to and harvest the source, we still need to tell it what the source is. So let's create a variable, and we're going to call it source. And in this variable, what we need to do is we need to assign it to this energy source right here. Now, your first instinct is probably to look again in the game object. And then in here, look for that particular source. And that's not a bad instinct. So let's go look at that game object, and you can see we have all these different properties here. You've got the creeps, you've got the flags, and you've got the map. And this one might have what we want in it. The market, the resources, you might be tempted to investigate this one, but I can tell you that this isn't going to have the source location that we're looking for. The rooms, you might suspect that maybe you could go looking inside of this room and that might have a reference to the source. And I think those are our candidates, so either rooms or maybe map. So let's take a look at the map. Okay, so the map just has a bunch of methods in it, and it doesn't look like any of them are going to have the data that we want. So let's check out rooms. In the rooms object, you can see that this does have a reference to the controller, which is nice because we'll need that next. But you can see it doesn't have any properties referencing the sources. It does have this find method, and you can actually use that to get a list of all the sources within a room, and then you can filter those sources to get the one that you want. But you'll find this code is a little more complicated, and you can even just peek here on the right and see that it's more complicated. And there's actually an easier way to do it that I want to show you. So I want to draw your attention back to the game object. And it has this method getObjectById. And the great thing about getObjectById is that it's a really fast lookup. And everything inside the game of Screeps has a unique ID. And you can use this to quickly get a reference to any object. So whether it's a creep or a structure or something else inside the room like an energy source, you can use getObjectById on it. So that's what I'm going to show you how to do right here. So using the global game object, we're going to call getObjectById on it. And to use that method, all we need to do is pass in a string with the ID of the thing we want to reference. So in the game, go ahead and select the source. And you'll notice right below this blue bar that says source on the right, it says ID, and then there's this long string. So go ahead and copy that string, and it's going to be different for you than it is for me. And we can paste that in as the argument for getObjectById. And of course, remember the semicolon. And this will now give us a reference to this source. So it's referenced specifically to this specific source. It's not the source down here on the left. It's not this source over here. Specifically this source. And now that we have a reference to it, we can go ahead and use that to move to it and to harvest from it. And you can do this with anything else inside the game, like the spawn, it has an ID. Or creeps, they all have IDs as well. So if you preferred, you could use game.getObjectById to reference your creep right here. But when your creep dies, and creeps don't last forever, the new creep that gets generated to replace it, it'll have a different ID. So I don't recommend doing that because your code will break after about an hour or so. But in this case, for the source, it's okay to use getObjectById because we know that this source isn't going to be destroyed, it's not going to disappear, and it's always going to have this same ID. So it's perfectly fine to use in this situation. So let's commit our code, and hopefully our creep will start moving over to the source and start harvesting it. And I'm going to speed up the ticks here. And I find that the simulation room can actually go a little slower if you go above 2 ticks per second, so I'll just leave it right here. Now that the creep is at the source, you should see that it starts to gain energy. And if we look at its attributes, we can see that, yeah, it does have 2 energy now that it's carrying. So what happened was it did harvest once, and from that one harvest, we got 2 energy out of it. And then in this if statement that we wrote, our creep's energy store, this part, is now 2, which doesn't equal to 0. So it's not entering this if block, this code inside the curly brackets. And so it's not running this code, and that's because this whole condition inside the parentheses evaluates to false. So this down here is never run. So now in this situation where we do have energy, we want to do what we wrote in this last comment. But if our creep does have energy, bring it to the controller and upgrade it. So we can accomplish this by adding an else to our if. You do that by adding the keyword else, and then again the curly brackets to hold the code that we want. And this will hold the code that we want to only run if this if condition is false. And I'm going to move this comment inside of this else block as well. So if this statement inside the if condition is true, it's going to run the code inside these first curly brackets. Else, if it's not true, it's going to run the code inside of these second curly brackets. So right here, we want to listen to the logic that we wrote in our comment. We'll start with myCreep.moveTo. In this case, we want to move to our controller, which again is a variable that doesn't exist yet. And then myCreep. You'll notice that there's an upgrade controller. And in that method, you need to give it the controller to upgrade. Don't forget the semicolon. And that should be all the code we need to move to and upgrade the controller once we've defined what controller is. So we'll create a new variable, call it controller. And we need to set it equal to the controller object inside of this room. And you'll remember when we were looking at the room object, it does actually have this controller object as one of its properties. So all we need now is to get the room object that our creep is currently in. And from that, we can easily grab the controller object. So we should go back and look at creep. Creep has this property called room, which just links to the room object that the creep is currently in. So the controller can simply be myCreep.room, and this will be the simulation room that our creep is currently in. And then that object will have a controller object inside of it. And so this whole bit of code will evaluate to this room controller object here. And this is one of the reasons I really like Screeps for teaching programming, because you can immediately relate a controller object inside the code to a controller object you can see within the game visuals. We'll go ahead and commit that. And now our creep has energy, so yeah, it's going to go over to the controller and upgrade it. And once it gets back down to 0 energy, well, the condition in the if statement is going to be true again. So it's going to execute this code to move to the source and harvest it. Until it gets some energy again, then it's going to execute the else code. And that's what it takes to write the simplest Screeps code possible. And this code will run indefinitely. You could leave it running for days or weeks, and you'll still have a creep running back and forth, upgrading the controller with energy. And every time your creep dies, your spawn will create a new one. So hopefully this was helpful. Hopefully you got a better idea about how Screeps organizes the data you need into objects and nested objects, and how methods on those objects allow you to perform the necessary actions inside the game. If you're new to programming, hopefully you got some sense for how to create a variable, what arrays are and how they work, same for hashes, what strings are, and hopefully you'll remember to always put the semicolon. And hopefully you understand the curly brackets, where they go, and how they isolate bits of your code from other parts of your code. So yeah, let me know if this was helpful, let me know if I missed anything, and I'll see you next time.